I am really honored to be here today. I'd like to thank Congressman Scott, who's sponsoring this particular panel, and Chairman Cleaver and other distinguished members of the Congressional Black Caucus for allowing me to share my thoughts today on the best ways to deal with the deficit and put America back on the right track to a prosperous economy. The current economic crisis has shown how current measures of economic performance increasingly mask the reality of life for millions of Americans. So if you look at the economy and economic statistics, I watch Bloomberg News every morning. I'm amazed that you hear conversations around GDP is positive, the earnings at the nation's largest corporations are at record levels, stock prices are soaring, and large corporations are sitting on trillions of dollars of cash and other liquid assets. But I also do a lot of reading during the course of the day as well. And I'm just amazed by the time I get to work. I've read about unemployment remaining high at 9%, and we know that number would be significantly higher if we took into account people who are working part-time but need full-time work, or if we took into account people who, in fact, have dropped out of the market for a lack of any jobs to apply for. Poverty and the severity of poverty are both large and growing. The small firms are struggling to keep their doors open, and job creation is anemic, and millions of families continue to lose their homes to foreclosure. Now, my remarks are kind of in the order that I wanted to give them, but I felt based on that question that was posed on the last panel, I kind of have to digress because I wanted to be part of that Q&A. That question was about the bank bailout. Didn't it work? Well, I have to say I kind of lean toward Dr. Darity. I think it was very inefficient, and I just was taking a few notes to sort of walk through why I say that. It's true we averted the second Great Depression, and of course that's a good thing. The bad thing is that the approach that we took really does explain these two worlds that we're watching. A lot of people are looking right now, and if you were to watch a lot of the news shows, you'd say, wow, well, that shows the free market enterprise and big corporations, they're just better positioned and they're doing better. No, it's not. It's because they were bailed out. It's that simple. It's not the invisible hand of Adam Smith. It is not the sort of organic way the economy works. That's all nonsense. And the way that you know that it's nonsense is if you look at a couple of things. You look at the fact that the bailout is continuing. It's continuing through 0% interest rates at the Federal Reserve that's accessible by the largest corporations. If any one of us had access to billions of dollars at 0%, I would fathom that you could probably make some money. And I'm willing to test that theory by asking that the Fed give me about $5 billion for about 2 weeks. I will come back and testify that I am sinfully wealthy and that I'm brilliant in business. Anyone can be brilliant in business if you're saturated in cash. And that is why those large earnings are not good earnings. And that is why the bailout continues. At some point, 0% interest has to end. And when that happens, we will see the real complexion of the economy. In fact, the largest banks are earning those dollars not based on contributing to productivity or creating jobs. It's not a result of lending. It's a result of proprietary trading. And all one has to do is look at the book of business and you'll see something that's very striking and disturbing. The largest banks sit on hundreds of billions of dollars, not millions, billions of dollars of second liens, much of which are overvalued because they're on houses that are upside down. Roughly 22% of loans outstanding are upside down. So this is a crisis of phenomenal proportion. It hasn't gone anywhere. It still exists. We're just ignoring it because we're continuing to bail out financial institutions. And most recently, you've heard a lot about something called quantitative easing. And so you see the beat goes on. And these disparate outcomes are due to the fact that when the crisis first ensued, the problem that the banks had was something called toxic assets in the form of foreclosures. And what's particularly important for this conversation is that those toxic assets were disproportionately bad loans, predatory loans, peddled to communities of color. Had we addressed the bank's problem, toxic assets, by helping homeowners maintain their homes, we wouldn't have the foreclosure crisis we have today, and guess what? We would have averted the Great Depression as well, because we would have shored up the assets that the banks had. Instead, we simply treated it as a liquidity problem, channeled trillions, not billions of dollars, as Dr. Darity said, to financial institutions. And it's propped them up, and it's avoided the depression, but it hasn't fixed America's economic problem. We still have it, and we still have a major financial crisis that we haven't fully recognized. Now back to my script. Meaningfully reducing the deficit cannot be achieved solely by reducing domestic spending. And in fact, I have to come back to one last thing that was in the conversation with Dr. Darity and the other speaker, and that is, for the last 2 years, the largest driver of foreclosures has been, guess what? Unemployment. So there is a link, as he suggested. Now, meaningfully reducing the deficit cannot be achieved solely by reducing domestic discretionary spending. In fact, a sharp axe on domestic spending could further damage the struggling economy by triggering less spending and promoting further job losses. This is not to say that nothing can be done to reduce the deficit. We can begin to close that deficit with the repeal of many tax giveaways that do not add to economic productivity, but rather act as a further drag on the economy. The Congressional Black Caucus and several of the speakers today have already identified many of these tax concessions that could be reined in, so I won't focus on them in my remarks. In addition, it's worth keeping in mind that America has more than just a budget deficit problem. This nation is experiencing an employment deficit, a competitive deficit, and a shared prosperity deficit. Now, the good news is that addressing these three latter deficits is the most efficient and effective way to resolve the first deficit, which is a budget deficit. Some policy recommendations I will offer will not incur any additional spending. I'm sure that's good news to members of Congress. Others will, unfortunately, require new spending to ensure the long-term health of the economy and responsible deficit levels in the future. Now, in the limited time I have today, I'm going to do as Lisa did, which is focus on maybe about three items. And the first item that I'm going to focus on is the foreclosure crisis. I have to say I'm amazed, I'm mesmerized by the idea that somehow the U.S. economy is going to recover. In fact, when the problem that was the epicenter of the crisis in the beginning continues. Through most of 2010, foreclosure filings exceeded more than 300,000 per month. A dramatic reduction in bank repossessions at the end of the year was not due to a reduction in the number of families unable to pay their mortgages, but rather due to legal problems within the banking system. Yes, more problems besetting the financial system because we didn't resolve the foreclosures. And as long as those foreclosures continue, more and more problems. Now we've got legal problems. I can talk about them if someone is interested in Q&A. Still, there are roughly 2.9 million foreclosures last year, and the largest data collection entity that focuses on this issue estimates that it could be as much as 20% higher this year. In other words, the problem that started in 2007 as a foreclosure crisis has simply gotten larger every single year, and this year will be no different. But here's a caveat. It may not be as large this year because the legal problems with the servicers may slow them down. What does that mean? That simply means that we will be pushing the housing problem into next year in 2013 or even further, which means we'll continue to have a drag on the economy. Well, what a drag on the economy is that, and why am I so fixated on foreclosures? Because they are hammering house prices. House prices are at an historic low. We've now had house prices nationally drop below what they were the drop of the Great Depression, and they're still falling. Stemming foreclosures is therefore essential to shoring up the economy and reducing the deficit, and it's worth pointing out that falling house prices have multiple effects on the economy. First of all, the typical family's largest single source of wealth is the family home. So as that home price declines, so does the family's net wealth. That has two effects. One, it takes away additional discretionary spending to the extent that they no longer have housing equity to tap. And second of all, it creates a retrenchment mentality. In other words, consumer confidence wanes. Coming out of the 2001 recession, it was housing equity that allowed us to drive our way out of that recession. That bubble is gone, fortunately, and hopefully it will never return. But the reality of it is that we don't have anything on the horizon to compensate for or replace that lost housing equity. So I would recommend three things, first related to the foreclosure crisis. First, we need to increase the effectiveness of the Home Affordable Modification Program, or HAMP. That program was allocated $46 billion 2 years ago. And the fact of the matter is, as of the close of December of last year, a full $1 billion, yes, $1 billion, had been drawn down on that program. The program has worked painfully poorly. And in fact, I believe right now, if you look at the HAMP modifications that directly tap the TARP dollars that are allocated, there are multiple programs within the federal government, but the one that's tapping HAMP is about 10,000 modifications in an environment where we're having about 250 to 300,000 foreclosure filings each month. The Special Inspector General for TARP, the GAO, several nonprofit research centers, including NCRC, and a paper I co-authored called The 5 Realities, goes into great specificity and detail on a number of things that can be done to improve the HAMP program without costing any additional dollars. The second thing we need to do is enact changes to the bankruptcy code to allow the outstanding debt on principal residences to be adjusted by bankruptcy judges. Now, currently, the family home is the only major asset that cannot be modified by a bankruptcy court. Yet the debt on a luxury yacht or rental property can be modified. This restriction serves no public policy purpose whatsoever, none. You can modify your yacht, but not your home. In the middle of a crisis, again, we go back to the debate that ensued on the last panel. We don't pass bankruptcy reform. Instead, we err to passing out over $11 trillion in direct grants, loans, guarantees, and other supports rather than doing bankruptcy modification, which could have taken a third of the problems off the table. I think I've said enough about that. Now, I should point out that not everyone's in favor of bankruptcy protection. The opponents say it will undermine the housing market. I smile every time I hear that. How can you get more undermined than right now? There is no housing market. It's completely moribund. In fact, according to FHA Commissioner David Stevens, it's on life support. It's all federally supported. And even the major proposals on how we get the financial system back on its legs and the housing finance system work, almost every private sector proposal is proposing federal guarantees. But we can't have bankruptcy reform. Okay. More effectively, we need to address the government-sponsored enterprises. They are facing massive losses in potentially the hundreds of billions of dollars. And unfortunately, the real losses from those entities for this ongoing foreclosure crisis are not completely transparent or clear to the American public. One of the challenges is that we need to adjust principals outstanding on homes heading to foreclosure. But there is a resistance to do that with the government-sponsored enterprises because those losses are borne directly now by the federal taxpayer or federal citizens. I think it's citizens. But here's the rub. The losses are going to be the losses. So the longer we let those losses occur, the more homes will go into foreclosure and the larger the losses will be. So when we're talking about deficit reduction, we should have an accurate estimate of what the real projections are for the losses of the GSEs. And if it costs less money just to go ahead and accept the loss, $50 billion, $100 billion, $200 billion right up front, we need to do it, put a floor under falling home prices, and allow the housing market to actually pick back up, because I believe you would see a dramatic turn of events if, in fact, we stem the foreclosure crisis. But as long as we ignore the cost of these foreclosures, again, we're pushing the crisis off into next year and the year after, and most of this deficit reduction conversation, in my view, is going to be pure academics if, in fact, we can't get the rudder seriously back in the water on the economy. Now, a couple of other things we could do is we could reprogram some of the dollars that are allocated toward the HAMP program. I won't go through the numbers because they are dizzyingly complicated, but suffice it to say that the Congressional Budget Office estimates that of about $12 billion in total of the $46 billion is is actually likely to be spent through that program. There are a number of programs, such as the Hardest Hit Fund, that was actually enacted. It was allocated, I believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of about $10 billion. There's an FHA refinance program that, now, Hardest Hit Fund has just under $8 billion allocated toward it. I think $100 million has been spent so far. There's a special FHA refi program that has close to $10 billion that's been allocated to it. I think 15 refinancing have occurred through that program. So I think we should consider reprioritizing some of those HAMP dollars. And what would I reprioritize them on? I would reprioritize them on the Neighborhood Stabilization Program, specifically the funding criteria in NSP2. It was well developed by HUD. It's well designed to go to the most distressed communities, but I would do it with a spin. I would connect programs for employment as well as programs for other social services with housing and foreclosure, and let communities figure out how best they can solve their own multifaceted economic and housing crisis from this program. We could have somewhere in the neighborhood of between $20 to $30 billion going to those communities in a way in which they decide how they use those dollars. That would be real stimulative to the economy, and it would not require new dollars. It would be using dollars that have already been provided. And my final recommendation builds on Dr. Austin's of the previous panel. The core problem that brought the financial system and economy to its knees was a foreclosure crisis, but the extreme economic distress we continue to experience is due to structural and economic problems that have long been in the making. The migration of jobs out of the country, shifting of national wealth and income to an increasingly small share of very wealthy households, the seeming inability for the nation to create new jobs, and increasing economic distress for the nation's most economically vulnerable families have been growing for 3 decades. The nation has failed through public policy to acknowledge and respond to the shifting winds of global competition and its implications for middle and working class Americans. The nation is in need of a competitive agenda that would include policy recommendations on trade, taxation, and spending. And I would say also include infrastructure spending, job creation, education, economic mobility, and shared economic prosperity. Some policy changes, such as in the tax arena, could go a long way toward offsetting the cost of such a powerful and comprehensive program. In conclusion, while it's true the deficit is a major worry, the most substantial challenge for America, in my view, is whether we will invest in our future while we still have that option. Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you. So my first question to you is this. Listening to your opening remarks, at what point is dealing with the actual budget deficit, at what point do you think it becomes a crisis that we have to deal with immediately?
Could you repeat that?
When do we have to deal with the budget deficit? At what point does it become a crisis that we have to deal with immediately, that we can't put off any further? Are we at that point now, or how long in the future do we have to deal with it?
Yeah, my view is when you're in a recession, which in my view we're actually in a recession, it doesn't matter what the numbers say. When you're looking at the numbers of high unemployment, the growing poverty, etc., that is not the time you say, oh, now I need to tighten my belt. We all know we need to stimulate the economy, and you cannot stimulate the economy by reducing your spending. But what you can do, and what I would say is urgent right now, is to repeal unproductive holes in the budget called tax preferences that don't stimulate the economy. So, for example, tax preferences above $200,000, the estate tax, and all of these other things, which are great giveaways, are not helping us. They're hurting us because the deficit really does count. But I think one last thing I'll say, it's not just a matter of is the deficit high or not? It's why is that deficit high? Because the highest deficit we ever had came out of World War II. And yet the following 30 years were the strongest period of sustained economic prosperity and shared prosperity for America. It's because we invested in infrastructure, and that's what we need to do right now, and we need not to waste time getting around to that.
Okay, Lisa, let me ask you this question. Let me ask you the question. At what point can we not put the deficit off anymore? I'll try it again.
Looking at a little grid we prepped on what the various commissions we're aiming for. The President's Commission, the Bowles-Simpson Commission, was trying to get to a deficit of 2.2% of GDP by 2015. I think all thoughtful efforts are trying to echo what Jim has said, which is, don't prune everything now in an emergency, but where are we in 2015? We're 2011 now. So I think Congressman Scott is asking us a tricky question, which is, what are we doing now in this budget that sets us on that path? Everybody's trying not to constrain demand further so that we create a worse recession. So that is the challenge now, and I love Jim's point about holes. I think it's irresponsible to enter this conversation saying don't pay any attention to it. That makes our voices sound very weak. I think we're paying attention to it. And I think even the most progressive-leaning, EPI and Demos are looking to bring deficits, to 3.7% in 2020. So I guess I'd like to say we're on the move to bring things back. Nobody's saying anything in 2011. The most aggressive are saying we make progress by 2015. And even if you left it alone, even the CBO score says it'll be 4.6% in 2015. So I think the question is, what are we doing now in the budget of fiscal year 2012? What are we doing now that sets it on the right path? And I think you heard a powerful argument for deal with foreclosures. In my estimation, what I would also add is that you're going to, if there is a call for tax reform, do the tax policies now that build household wealth and that put something back in this economy. Those will be the things that will be the trade-offs in the loopholes that will actually contribute to growth. Putting a tax credit, I want to just say one more thing, Jamal. Putting stocks, creating a new demand for stocks through a child account or through a new kind of IRA, pulling 40 million people into a savings system, that's a direct stimulus to markets. It's not some welfare giveaway. So we shouldn't be drawn into this where there's no investment that is part of putting things back on the right course, reducing a deficit and growing the economy.
So, sure.